That out of the way. I think you should just got a pop-up that said this is being recorded.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. And good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today for this wonderful conversation around Concord and the Civil War. Um, while you're joining in to familiarize yourself with the platform today in chat, please let us know where you're joining from. Myself, I'm joining from right downtown in the city of Boston, overlooking the State House. So I get the joy of sitting down here today and really getting to listen to this conversation about our history, which is really a lot here in Massachusetts. Thank you. We got somebody from Tennessee. So like I said, familiarize yourself in chat. Let us know where you're joining from today. It'll just give us a better idea. But I know this was a national audience. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Looks like we got some good history states here: Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Ohio, Louisiana, Minnesota. Awesome. Thank you all for doing that and sharing. Please continue to share. I'm just going to do a couple of brief comments here, and then we will get the presentation started. I'm Antron Watson. I'm here with AARP Massachusetts. I want to thank you all for joining us for this program today, when we're going to talk about the history of the Civil War, and specifically in Concord. As you know, ARP has been fighting for older adults for years, protecting Social Security, Medicare, advocating for the things that matter most to you, and older adults. And the work that we do continues to be successful because of folks like yourself and people aging across the nation. As you think about ways to get involved or wanting to learn more, you can always visit aarp.org slash MA for Massachusetts, or you can always replace the MA abbreviation with your state abbreviation and learn what's happening in your state. Other ways to learn about other ways to get involved is aarp.org/local. You will always get some good information about programming specifically in your neighborhood and stay up to date on activities where you can be get involved. Um, I feel like I've said a lot here, said enough. And I see Jeff already has a fan club in chat. So I will, without further ado, turn it over to Jeff to get us started. Thank you so much for joining, Jeff.
Hey, Antron, thanks so much. I appreciate and all the good work you folks do, you and the organization. Hello, everybody from, I guess, all over the country, it sounds like. It's nice to have you here and nice to be chatting with you about Concord and the Civil War. Most people, when they come to Concord to take part in this walking tour that we offer occasionally on Fridays, I always ask them, why would you want to come to Concord for a Civil War tour? I mean, after all, there was there was no battle fought in Concord. And I also ask them if they had any ancestors who participated in the Civil War. And if you did, and you'd like to let me know later, Entron's going to share my email with you. I will share that with you. So if you want to send me some information about your ancestors in the Civil War, I'd love to hear. And then I absolutely would love to respond. Okay, so I ask them about Concord. What do they think of? Well, they usually think of the authors and the shot heard around the world. April 19, 1775, first-time colonists were ordered to fire on their own army because they were all British subjects. And it was the first time the colonists had killed members of their own. So that was a huge moment. It would end up being, of course, day one of our American Revolution, which lasted over 8.5 years. Of course, the following year, my hometown of Philadelphia, the Declaration of Independence was signed. The second sentence of which reads, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet, after we won our independence in 1783, and then a few years later ratified the United States Constitution, it turned out that, according to our government, not all men were created equal, were they? And women didn't have many rights at all. Slavery was allowed to continue. There was a compromise made in the Constitution whereby the slave trade was supposed to end 20 years later, in 1808. Of course, that didn't really happen. Most people thought slavery was going to die out. The main crops in the South, of course, as you know, tobacco and cotton, very labor intensive. Picking cotton was back-breaking work. And then picking the seeds out of the cotton was very tedious. It took a long time. So people thought perhaps slavery would die. And this guy, 1793, he was born in Massachusetts, by the way, went south, and he invented a machine that solved one of those problems. The cotton gin pulled seeds out of the cotton, and now it's going to make cotton eventually king cotton. And of course, cotton was wanted all over the place, including in the mills up here in New England. So I would say that in the 1800s, very few people had clean hands. Slavery is going to tear apart this country. We're unfortunately going to have to fight a war to end it. And of course, there'll be many things that will lead to that war. One of the first, the Missouri Compromise in 1820, when Missouri wanted to come in as a state. So they came up with the Missouri Compromise, whereby Missouri would come in as a slave state, and Maine would be carved out of Massachusetts and come in as a free state. So you still had a balance of power in Congress, 11 free, 11 slave. But there was a provision in the Missouri Compromise that was really important, and that is that government said that in the future, any state coming in above the southern border of Missouri, that would be marked by that red line you see on the map, would not be able to come in as a slave state. And keep that in mind as we move ahead with this. You know, Massachusetts is going to be the center of the abolitionist movement, Boston in particular, Concord as well. A lot of towns around Boston. And this gentleman, William Lloyd Garrison, will be one of the most famous abolitionists. And he will start publishing The Liberator, an abolitionist paper, on the first day of January of 1831. And in that first edition, he will write, "I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch. And I will be heard." And he will be heard. He actually will come out to Concord in the 1830s and speak and have a great influence on a certain group of people in the town of Concord. And when I give this walking tour, I always ask people, well, do you think it was the women or the men? Everybody always says the women. And they're right. Mary Merrick Brooks and Bigelow. And by the way, all these people will help in the Underground Railroad at various times. Virginia and Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson's second wife, his first wife died very young. So Sophia Thoreau and Helen Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau's sisters. Susan Garrison, a free Black. Louisa May Alcott, the famous author of Little Women, her mom. Not Louisa May, she was only 5 years old in 1837 when the Concord ladies formed their anti-slavery society. And this famous abolitionist from Boston, Wendell Phillips, who will come out to Concord as well, will say this about Mary Merrick Brooks years later. When more than 30 years ago, I joined the anti-slavery movement, one of the first places I visited was Concord. Mrs. Brooks welcomed me to the town. She was one, and the chief one, of half a dozen royal-minded women who represented the anti-slavery purpose of the place. The famous men who lived there turned then only a tolerant eye on the cause. But she and her associates lived for their reform ideas. These women and men, I should say eventually the men, directed their community to right the national wrong of slavery, which had been inherited from those who had fired the shot heard round the world in their backyard. Well, the men did eventually. Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's father, Henry David Thoreau, become a staunch abolitionist. And other abolitionists will come to speak in Concord, including Ralph Waldo Emerson will speak, and Frederick Douglass will speak in the town for the first time in 1841 in that church in downtown Concord. At the time, the Universalist Church is now the Catholic Church. And Emerson will eventually come around. And on August 1st, 1844, when he was going to speak on the 10th anniversary of the emancipation of the thousands of enslaved people in the British West Indies, keep in mind Britain got rid of slavery in 1834. Henry David Thoreau, who was obviously a great fan of Ralph Waldo Emerson, was so excited that Emerson was going to speak on that occasion that he rushed to First Parish Church and asked the minister to ring the bell to let people know that Ralph Waldo was going to speak. Well, the minister was no abolitionist. He said, I'm not going to ring the bell. So Thoreau rushed up the steps and rang it himself. And the reason it's now sitting outside First Parish is that church burned down. It was rebuilt in the same style. The bell was damaged somewhat, but it was an important event, and it marks that in front of the church today. Thoreau, of course, most people know him for having written Walden, the result of his 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days at Walden Pond, which is about a mile south of Concord, and was an area that was property owned by Emerson, by the way. And Thoreau will build a very simple, small cabin there and become quite the naturalist. Live a very simple life. But he would come into Concord from time to time for errands. And one evening in July of 1846, he came in to the town. Now, we were at war with Mexico at that time. And the abolitionists saw this as a blatant attempt by the slaveholders to expand the country into Mexico and to expand slavery. And of course, that didn't happen. But they weren't happy about the war anyway. But he came in that evening and he was stopped by a childhood acquaintance of his, a fellow by the name of Sam Staples, who happened to be the jailer. And Sam stopped Henry. He said, Henry, you haven't paid your poll tax in a number of years. You had to pay a small tax in order to have the right to vote back in those days. Henry said, I am not going to pay a tax to a government that allows slavery. Sam said, I have to put you in jail, Henry, if you don't. Well, put me in jail then. So he did. He spent one night in jail. Somebody bailed him out. We believe it probably was his aunt who lived in town. But it will lead him to read a piece that would eventually be called Civil Discourse, the main theme of which is that it's okay to violate a law if you're in pursuit of some social goal. That whole concept will influence a number of people in the future, including Martin Luther King. Well, this building in downtown Concord, built in 1851, is called the Town House. It's now called the Town Hall. A lot of the town's offices are housed there. And it was an important place for our topic today, because on the second floor, there is a room called the Great Hall. And some important people spoke there. I'm going to talk about one of them in just a second. But note the large painting on the front wall. It was done in the early 20th century. It's called Memories of Antietam. It shows well over a dozen Union veterans of the Civil War, one of whom I'm going to talk about a little later. And it was done by the woman shown in the bottom left. Elizabeth Wentworth Roberts was actually originally from Philadelphia, moved to Concord when she was a little older. And she painted that, as I said, in the early part of the 20th century, called Memories of Antietam. I don't know if you've heard of Antietam. Antietam, also called the Battle of Sharpsburg, was fought on September 17th. It was our country's bloodiest day. Confederate and Union casualties numbered over 23,000. Killed, wounded, captured, missing. Our country's worst day. Only two of those veterans in that painting, by the way, were at Antietam, but nonetheless, that's what she called it. But the Great Hall, some important people spoke there. Before we go to that, I want to just reiterate again, there were so many events that are going to lead to the Civil War. I think there's one in particular that is going to hurl us towards that awful 4-year-long war. But there were others, like the Compromise of 1850, when California was allowed to come in a free state, the Fugitive Slave Law, which actually the original Fugitive Slave Law was signed in 1793, but it was strengthened in 1850. Harriet Beecher Stowe, a Massachusetts woman, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Underground Railroad, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Now, you remember from the Missouri Compromise that part of the compromise said that no state coming in after that was above the southern border of Missouri, the 3630 line, by the way, would be allowed to come in as a slave state. Well, the Kansas-Nebraska Act threw that out the window, because when Kansas and Nebraska are going to apply for statehood, they're going to allow the people to decide whether they're going to come in as a free or a slave state. They called it popular sovereignty. So that part of the Missouri Compromise was invalid. Now, Nebraska is not going to be an issue. In Kansas, it's definitely going to be an issue, because pro-slavery people from Missouri are going to flood Kansas, and free staters are going to do the same and try to keep Kansas a free state. And here, one of those abolitionists, John Bright, who went to Kansas in the falls of 1855. A couple of his sons were already out there. He was determined to keep Kansas free. He unfortunately is going to get involved in some rather nefarious activities, some of the fighting, because Kansas is going to eventually be known as Bleeding Kansas. And yes, that's an interesting portrait of Brown. In late May of 1856, he, a couple of his sons, and some of his other followers are going to take part, are going to, in what we call the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, when 5 pro-slavery men are hacked to pieces by Brown and his men. And he takes part in some of the other fighting up there. But because of that, it changes his appearance. An alias, several aliases actually over the next few years. And this may be the image of Brown you're more familiar with. Well, Brown has other things in mind other than just keeping Kansas free, although that's the most important thing in 1857. But he comes to Concord in January of that year to meet this guy, Franklin Sanborn. And by the way, that's a photograph of downtown Concord in the spring of 1865, towards the end of the Civil War. Some of those buildings still stand in Concord. Franklin Sanborn, born in New Hampshire, graduated from Harvard, came out to Concord to start a school under the auspices of, with the help, I should say, of Ralph Waldo Emerson. In fact, Sanborn School, and I have a couple of Emerson's kids. But Sanborn takes a leave of absence to become the secretary of the Massachusetts State Kansas Committee, which is a committee devoted to keeping Kansas a free state. And Brown, when he comes to New England in 1857, in January of that year, knows of Franklin Sanborn. He's heard about this guy. He realizes Sanborn's a very famous abolitionist, and Sanborn knows all the other abolitionists in Massachusetts, including those who have something that Brown's really going to need in order for him to succeed in his anti-slavery activity. Moral support, yeah, that's important, but not as important as money. Sanborn knows all of those guys, and he's going to introduce Brown to them. Sanborn's quite taken by Brown, as are all of the abolitionists. They will become known as the Secret Six. You can see Sanborn in the upper left, upper center, in the upper and the left, excuse me, the upper left is George Luther Stearns, who's a wealthy merchant in Boston. Upper right, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who's a Unitarian minister in Worcester, Massachusetts. Bottom left, Gerrit Smith, a wealthy landowner in Peterborough, New York, and who, by the way, has already given some land to Brown, where Brown will construct a house and his family will live. Bottom center, Samuel Gridley Howe, who's an important physician in Boston, and whose wife, Julia Ward Howe, will write the words to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And bottom right, Theodore Parker, a Unitarian minister in Boston. All abolitionists, rabid abolitionists, I would say, and some of them have significant amount of money. Brown needs their help. Now, he's going to wander all over New England seeking financial assistance, but these six are the ones who will provide the most, particularly Stearns and Smith. But when Brown back in May of 1859, and then making some other rounds in New England, he will leave having taken something close to $5,000. In 1859, folks, is a heck of a lot of money. Well, in September of 1859, in Concord, there will be the Massachusetts militia muster. Now, the 1859 militia service in Massachusetts is voluntary, but over 5,000 are in the various militia units in Massachusetts. So if a conflict will come, Massachusetts will be ready. Well, what does Brown have in mind? Kansas will eventually come in as a free state in 1861, but Brown has something else in mind, and it has to do with a small town in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now the state of West Virginia. And if you look on the map, Harper's Ferry is almost the dead center. Harper's Ferry is at the confluence of the Shenandoah and the Potomac River. And Harper's Ferry, maybe some of you never heard of it, but in 1859, there are two weapons factories there. And if you look at this diagram, Harper's Ferry, you see the Potomac River in the upper right, And along the Potomac River, stretched out for 600 yards, was the United States Armory grounds and also some arsenal buildings. They were producing upwards of 10,000 weapons a year. The other weapons factory is along the Shenandoah River, and it's called Hall's Rifle Works. It's down towards the lower left. Brown's idea is he's going to find a place to live with his 21 followers, including 3 of his sons, in Maryland, across the Potomac River from Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And he's going to enter Harper's Ferry, capture the town. Hopefully the slaves will rise up. He will arm them and teach them how to use weapons. They certainly are not told how to use guns in slaveholding states. And start a slave rebellion and end slavery. Here's an image of the United States Armory along the Potomac River. That's Maryland Heights on the left, and all the land on the right side of the Potomac is Virginia. Here's a photograph taken of the Armory. The arsenal buildings are not in the photograph. This was taken during the Civil War. And please note that building on the left, that's the engine house, where fire engines were there in the event of a fire. Well, Brown is going to enter on Sunday, October 16th, 1859. And it didn't go so well. Well, depending how you look at it. 10 of his followers, including 2 of his sons, will be killed. Brown and 4 of his followers will be captured in the engine house. That drawing you see on the left shows United States Marines from the Washington Naval Yard have been sent by train, and they are under the command of a guy who was home on leave of absence, Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. And tagging along with Lee to Harper's Ferry was a young lieutenant in Lee's unit, a fellow by the name Lieutenant Jeb Stuart. So Brown's captured along with some of his men, and he's put on trial. You can see an image of the trial on the right. He's accused of 3 things: murder, because some citizens of the town of Harper's Ferry are killed, including the mayor; treason against the state of Virginia; and trying to start a slave insurrection. The most serious is the third one, trying to start a slave insurrection. The South was petrified of that type of thing. They had already dealt with a number of them, including the 1831 Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia. Well, Brown is sentenced to be hanged, and he will be hanged on December 2nd, 1859, in Charlestown, Virginia, now Charlestown, West Virginia. And before he's taken to the gallows, he hands a note to the jailer whom he had befriended. And part of the note read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." The reaction to Brown's raid, a Northerner coming down with other Northerners, as well as 5 African Americans and 2 Canadians, to start a slave rebellion. The South responded in several ways. Started coming down harder on their blacks, both free and slave. They started creating more militia groups, particularly in the upper South, to look for more John Browns. And they started talking more and more about secession, that is, leaving the United States. And when the Democratic National Convention met in Charleston, South Carolina, in April of the next year to nominate a candidate for the presidential election, the Democratic Party split. The Southern Democrats stayed in Charleston and nominated John C. Breckinridge, who happened to be the current vice president under Buchanan. The Northern Democrats held a convention in Baltimore, Maryland, and nominated Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas. And with the Democratic Party split, it made the Republican candidate the winner. And the Republican candidate didn't even get 40% of the vote. And of course, the Republican candidate was this guy, Abraham Lincoln. Now, when Lincoln took office, well, he wouldn't be inaugurated until March of 1861, but after he won the election, he said, slaves, the Southern slave states, I'm not going to do away with slavery. I don't want it to spread, but I'm not going to touch it where it already exists. What I'm most concerned with is reuniting the country. But unfortunately, the radical pro-slavery group in the South didn't believe him and pushed the states to secede. The first one, December 20th, 1860, will be South Carolina. And before the first shots of the Civil War are fired at Fort Sumter, April 12th, 1861, Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. By that time, 7 southern states have left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, and we were into a terrible 4-year-long Civil War. And here in Concord, oh my Lord, Louisa May Alcott will write in April of 1861, of course, the town is a high state of topsy-turviness, for everyone is boiling over with excitement. And when quiet Concord does get stirred up, it is a sight to behold. All the young men and boys drill with all their might. The women and girls sew and prepare for nurses. The old folks settle the fate of the nation in groves of newspapers, and the children make the streets hideous with distracted drums and fifes. One young man in Concord will write in April of 1861, when the order came for me to join my unit, I was plowing in the same field in Concord where my grandfather was plowing when the British fired on the Massachusetts men in Lexington. He did not wait a minute, sir, and I did not. Well, there are going to be a lot of men joining, both North and South. Lincoln's calling for 75,000 militia to respond to this emergency, but only to serve 3 months. And why did they join? And this is one of the reasons I believe that people don't think of slavery as being the main cause getting us into the Civil War, because most of the young men, North and South, were joining for other reasons, like peer pressure, impressing my girlfriend, excitement of traveling on a railroad, seeing another part of the country, getting a uniform, getting paid, patriotism, my president asked me, or whatever. But I want to read something to you. And this was a speech given by this man, Alexander Stephens, who was a congressman from Georgia before the war and actually a friend of Lincoln's. But he became the vice president of the Confederate States of America. And this is part of something he said in March of 1861. Some of this language is quite offensive, but let me read this for you. Our new government's foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. The new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution. African slavery, as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization, this was the immediate cause of the late rupture. Slavery was the main reason for getting us into the war. All right, in Concord, this man, Captain George Prescott, who commands one company in the 5th Massachusetts Militia, Remember that militia muster we talked about a few minutes ago? A company being about 100 men at full strength. They will respond, and they will be one of the first Massachusetts units to reach Washington in April of 1861, preceded only by the 6th Massachusetts Militia, shown in the drawing to the left. Prescott's company of the 5th Massachusetts Militia and the rest of his unit will see some action at the first major battle of the Civil War on July 21st, 1861, a place called Bull Run, Manassas. It will end up being first Manassas, the first Bull Run, because there'll be a second battle fought there the following August. They come home after their 3-month service, and Prescott then starts recruiting for a 3-year-long unit, which will be a company in the 1st Massachusetts Battalion. 4 companies, about 400 men, who are being raised to be the garrison troops in Fort Warren, which is in Boston Harbor. You can still visit the place. The 1st Massachusetts Battalion got there in November of 1861, and their first meal in the mess hall apparently didn't impress them very much. It was bread and tea. According to the regimental historian, the loaves of bread, quote, were converted into missiles, and the air was alive with them, the evening light favoring an impartial distribution. So you can imagine the loaves of bread being thrown around the mess hall. At some point, the commander of the fort, Colonel Dimick, walked in and was struck by one of these flying loaves, quote, which, with a refinement of ingenuity, had been dipped in hot tea. You can imagine Dimick was not very happy. He found the man responsible and lectured him on military etiquette and discipline. Eventually, the 1st Massachusetts Battalion will be sent down to Washington City in 1862, where they will be converted into a regular infantry regiment in the Union Army, meaning 10 companies, full strength, ideally 1,000 men, although the 32nd Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which is what they will be called, will never reach that number. And here are 2 members from that unit, the 32nd Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, and they will join the main Union Army of the Potomac at Harrison's Landing, which is along James River, about 20 miles southeast of Richmond. Now, the Army of the Potomac had just finished fighting against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate Army, in what was called the 7 Days Battle. And when the 32nd Massachusetts reached the Army of the Potomac in their brand new uniforms, they felt very much out of place among the hardened veterans that had just participated in what we call the Peninsula Campaign. 32nd Massachusetts' first battle will be at Fredericksburg, Virginia in mid-December of 1862. But while they were marching towards Fredericksburg, by the way, Fredericksburg is about 50 miles south of Washington, D.C., they were short of food. And their quartermaster, Dana, quote, saw a fat turkey on a barnyard fence, and he was just about to dispatch it when their division commander, this gentleman, Brigadier General Daniel Butterfield, and his staff rode up and asked Dana, what were you doing? I was just about to shoot a buzzard, General. Buzzard, the general replied. That was a turkey, sir. Dana said, well, was it indeed? Well, how fortunate, General, that you came up as you did, for in 2 minutes more I should have shot him for a buzzard. Butterfield and his staff rode off, muttering something about Dana being an idiot or whatever. The 32nd Massachusetts, under at that time Colonel Prescott, will see some action at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. But their first big fight was at Gettysburg on the second day of the battle. And this monument, which is in the area of the wheat field, marks the place where the 32nd Massachusetts fought. They went into the fight with just under 230 men. Regiment was pretty small. Suffered 81 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, missing. Prescott himself was wounded, but he will survive. We're going to talk about one member of the 32nd in a moment, but this is a monument to all the Civil War soldiers from Concord, which was dedicated on that date, April 19th, 1867. Almost 450 young men from Concord, and this is in a town of just over 2,100, fought in the Union Army and Navy. Of those 450, 49 died of various causes and, of course, from combat. And if you look on the top center, 32nd Mass Volunteers, look for the fourth name down, Francis Buttrick. He was a private. He was mortally wounded at Gettysburg. And Sam Staples, the same guy who had jailed Henry David Thoreau, went down to Gettysburg to bring Buttrick back, because at the time he left, Buttrick was still alive. They hoped to bring him back home where they could nurse him back to health. But unfortunately, by the time that Staples got down there, Buttrick had passed away. Buttrick is the grandson of Major John Buttrick, who ordered the firing of his colonists on the British at the North Bridge. The shot heard around the world. And yes, Colonel George Lincoln Prescott was also killed. He was killed in mid-June 1864 in an attack on the Confederate fortifications outside of Petersburg, Virginia. Look also on the right, under the first Massachusetts H stands for heavy artillery. And look at the Melvin brothers, Asa, John, Samuel. They all joined in 1861. They joined the 14th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which in early 1862 was converted into a heavy artillery unit, which means it was increased in size from 1,000 to about 1,800. And they learned to work the big guns in fortifications around some of the cities. This is a photograph showing the 3rd Massachusetts Heavy Artillery. The 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery would have been doing the same thing around Washington City. John Melvin died of sickness in October of 1863. And then in mid-May of 1864, when the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army of the Potomac, was suffering terrible casualties, the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse and the Wilderness, the commander of all the Union armies, General Ulysses S. Grant, ordered some of these heavy artillery units out of Washington and said, join the Army, you're now going to fight as infantry. And the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery's first battle was at a place called Harris Farm, which is near Fredericksburg, Virginia. And they fought there on May 19th, 1864. They went into the fight with just over 1,600 men. They suffered 398 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. One of those captured was Samuel Melvin. And he eventually ended up at Andersonville Prison, which is in Georgia. Melvin kept a journal. And part of his journal entry on September 15th, 1864, noted that he was having trouble keeping his food down. And he was lying on some blankets, perhaps somewhere on that photograph that you see. Quote, the tent and blankets are just as full of lice and fleas as ever can be. As things look now, I stand a good chance to lay my bones in old Georgia. But I'd hate to as bad as one can, for I want to go home. Melvin will not go home. He died about 10 days later. He's buried in the Andersonville National Cemetery there, which is now a National Historic Site. He's buried there with about 13,000 other Union prisoners who died. By that time, the oldest brother, Asa, had also died, killed in an attack on the Confederate fortifications outside of Petersburg, Virginia. And he's buried probably in the National Cemetery in Petersburg. The youngest brother, James, also served in the Union Army, but survived. And years later, became a very successful businessman. And in the early 20th century, contacted this gentleman, Daniel Chester French, who by that time was a very famous sculptor. He sculpted the Minuteman statue, the North Bridge outside of Concord. He's probably best known for the statue he sculpted that sits in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Yes, he made the Lincoln statue. But James Melvin got him to make a memorial to James's 3 older brothers. And this is that memorial. It's called Morning Victory. Notice the spelling of morning. In honor of my 3 brothers who gave their life that this country might survive. Here it is, dedicated on the 45th anniversary of Idaho's death at Petersburg. Those are all veterans of the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery. Well, the people of Concord did a lot too. They made shirts and socks and provided blankets and bandages, all kinds of things, thousands of items for the hospitals around Washington City and in other places. And Louisa May Alcott, who's pictured here, who after the Civil War will, of course, write the famous book, Little Women, she served as well as a nurse in a hospital in Georgetown, which is now part of Washington, D.C. It was hard work, but she would also contract typhoid fever. She will write later, she was never ill before. She was never well after. And I have to think that typhoid will help lead to her early death in 1888 at the age of 56. A civilian victim of our Civil War. Well, I want to talk about a few other people, but if you look at the top right, under 54th Massachusetts Volunteers, you'll see the name of George Washington Dugan. The 54th Massachusetts, which was formed in the winter and spring of 1863, was a very famous unit in the Union Army. They were one of our first all-Black units. And George Washington Dugan enlisted in March of 1863. He had just lost his wife. Dugan was 44 years old. And the 54th Massachusetts is made famous in the movie Glory, which perhaps some of you have seen, with Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman, who you see in the center there of that picture. Matthew Broderick portrayed the white colonel who commanded, Robert Gould Shaw. And they marched off to war in the late spring of 1863. Included in their ranks were 2 sons of Frederick Douglass. They saw some action outside of Charleston, South Carolina, but their first big battle was an attack on Fort Wagner, a fortification, a Confederate fortification outside of Charleston, South Carolina. They led the Union attack on that day, and they went in with about 600 men. They suffered 273 casualties, killed, wounded, captured. And originally, Dugan's name was not on the plaque because he was listed as missing in action. So they're not sure what had happened to him, but eventually it was determined that he definitely had been killed. Here's the aftermath of that attack. And they made a new plaque, and it was dedicated last year. So we're glad to have his name where it belongs. A couple of other names. If you look at the upper center, 29th Massachusetts Volunteer, Lieutenant Ezra Ripley died of sickness, Vicksburg, Mississippi, in late July of 1863. He was the grandson of Reverend Ezra Ripley, who was the minister at First Parish in Concord for 60 years. Also, if you look at the bottom left, 20th Massachusetts Volunteers, known as the Harvard Regiment, because they had so many Harvard graduates. Their commander at Gettysburg, mortally wounded on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. You may recognize his name, Colonel Paul Joseph Revere. I want to introduce our last soldier, Lieutenant Edward A. Bartlett. Now, he was one of those in that painting I showed you a few moments ago called Memories of Antietam. But towards the end of the war, he had already been in a 9-month unit. He joined another unit in 1864. And here are some of his words from 1865. Quote, on the morning of April 3rd, 1865, the city of Richmond, Virginia, which, by the way, was the Confederate capital for most of the time, the city of Richmond was occupied by Union troops, and it was my good fortune to be a soldier in that army, serving as a lieutenant in the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. The 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, by the way, was an all-black unit. Then under the command of Colonel Charles Francis Adams, who happened to be the great-grandson of our second president of the United States, John Adams. Bartlett saw a boat coming up the James River towards the city of Richmond, and a group leave the boat. Quote, a group consisting of a squad of sailors escorting a number of officers and citizens. He led by his hand his young son, Tad, then 12 years old, who walked beside him, had some trouble keeping step with his father's long strides. Of course, that person, if you look on the painting just a little bit to the left of center, it was Abraham Lincoln entering the city of Richmond, which had just been evacuated by Confederates and would be occupied by Union troops. Bartlett went on to write, it was the last time I saw Abraham Lincoln. He was murdered 10 days afterwards at Ford's Theater in Washington. He had finished his work. The Great War was ended. The shackles removed from the slave. And just a few days later, on April 19th, 1865, they held a memorial service for Abraham Lincoln. There's First Parish Church. That's that bell I talked about a little earlier. In the memorial service, Ralph Waldo Emerson will give the main speech. Now, the people of Concord didn't know Lincoln. Emerson had met him a couple of times, but Lincoln was never in Concord. He'd only been to Massachusetts once, and that was to Boston, even though 2 of his sons went to Harvard. But this is what Emerson will say about Lincoln on that day. These are some of his words. He had a strong sense of duty. Rarely was a man so fitted to the event. He stood a heroic figure in the center of a heroic epic, and acclamations of praise for the task he had accomplished burst out into a song of triumph, which even tears for his death cannot keep down. Lincoln was not going to see the end of slavery. That would come with the passing of the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of that year, 1865. But of course, he would have a lot to do with it, as would the people of Massachusetts and the people of Concord. And with the end of slavery, you could say that we really had come full circle from those noble ideals that were expressed in the Declaration of Independence, when all men are created equal. Of course, in 1865, we still had a long way to go. And I would suggest we still do. That's it, folks. Thank you for joining me. Here are some pictures of me when I was working for the Park Service. There's my email address. Intron, that's it. That's the program.
Jeff, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation today. I mean, in chat, folks are cheering you on. So thank you very much for
You
this
are welcome.
history, the lesson, and just how it connects to all the history here across the state, across the country, honestly, but here specifically in Massachusetts and Concord. Um, Folks, if you have questions for Jeff, or I think Jeff said you can please reach out to him or share your connection to this history. His email is in chat as well as on the screen. I want to thank you all again for joining us today. This presentation was recorded, so we will make sure you get it in probably the next 2 days or so. You will receive a copy of the recording. So hopefully you can go back and play through this once again and really take a deeper dive into the history of this country. Want to thank you all again for joining us, and we hope you all have a wonderful day.